Growing up, our basement was more than just a space for storage. It was almost a living part of the house. On nights when the wind howled or the rain drummed on the roof, it almost seemed to breathe. Our cat, Luna, had always been a brave soul. She was an outdoor cat, seasoned by many a tussle with stray dogs and the odd raccoon. But each night, my parents would scoop her up and gently place her in the basement. It was her routine, one she'd never resisted. But then, one October night, everything changed. Luna had begun to act strangely. Every time we'd set her down on the basement landing, she'd sit frozen, her eyes wide and fixated on the stairs descending into darkness. She wouldn't go down. We brushed it off, thinking maybe she'd grown wary of the colder season, or that she was getting older. But then, after several nights, I began to hear her low, mournful yowling just beyond the basement door, an eerie sound that would stop the moment I opened it, only to resume minutes after closing. And it wasn't just her behavior that was strange. The entire house felt colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I woke up to a silhouette in my doorway. It was tall and still, not moving an inch. My heart froze, and I called out, thinking it was my sister. But the figure remained silent, fading back into the shadows as if it had never been there. I lay awake, listening for any creaks or footsteps, but the house had gone silent. A few days later, we found the basement infested with fleas. It made sense, at least superficially. My dad shrugged, saying Luna must have brought them in from outside, and he started an all-out war against the pests, deep cleaning, spraying, sealing off entryways. We figured that the problem would resolve soon enough. But even as days passed, there were still fleas, stubbornly clinging on, refusing to let our basement be. Luna's strange behavior only got worse. She now refused to enter the basement, no matter what, lingering instead on our front porch or huddling in some obscure corner, her ears constantly twitching as if she could sense something I couldn't see. Finally, I had to know what was going on. One evening after school, I ventured into the basement alone. The air grew colder as I descended, and that unsettling smell, something metallic and stale, lingered. I pushed forward, heading toward the far end of the basement, where we kept our old storage boxes. Then, as I passed the small, darkened crawl space at the back, I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady, and almost inhumanly calm. A shiver ran down my spine. I dared to glance toward the crawl space, and I saw something shift in the darkness. A figure crouched low, watching me. I took a step back, trying not to scream. But it was too late. The figure moved, lunging forward as if to grab me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The police came that night. They searched every inch of the basement and found the crawl space littered with strange, discarded items, old food wrappers, empty bottles, a few stained blankets. But there was no sign of the person, nothing to explain who or what they had been. After that, we kept the basement locked. Luna never went near it again, and neither did I. As the years passed, I tried to forget the incident, to convince myself it had all been some cruel, vivid dream. But every October, on nights when the wind howled and the house grew cold, I could swear I heard it again, the faintest sound of breathing, hidden somewhere beneath the house. And I knew, no matter how far I tried to run from it, that something would always be waiting in the shadows below. The years rolled by, and I rarely thought about the basement. My family went about life as if nothing had ever happened, and yet I knew that deep down we were all still haunted. Every October, my parents started double-checking locks and keeping lights on through the night. Luna, our cat, grew older and eventually passed, but her uneasy spirit seemed to linger in every corner of the house, especially when the autumn chill set in. Then, during my final year of college, I had to move back home. My father had taken a bad fall and needed help around the house. Coming back stirred up memories, and that first night back, I dreamt of the basement. I was standing at the top of the stairs, and the smell was back stale and metallic, clinging to the air like a ghost. In the dream, I felt something breathing right behind me, whispering just out of reach. I woke up in a cold sweat, my skin crawling. As much as I wanted to brush it off, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was calling me back to the basement. And as if on cue, that very next morning, we noticed the fleas again. "Not this," I muttered under my breath, examining the small red welts on my legs after going down to the laundry room, which was still in the basement. I hadn't been in the basement since I was a kid, but the cold dread that wrapped around me was painfully familiar. My dad laughed it off, saying, "Looks like our old friends have returned," but his smile was forced, and I saw a flicker of fear behind his eyes. The next night, I heard it again. Breathing. It was faint, as if someone was lying in wait. I was sure it was just my imagination, or the creaks of the house settling. But the hairs on the back of my neck told a different story. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to stretch toward my door, leaning in as if to listen, to watch. Driven by a strange mixture of terror and curiosity, I decided I'd face whatever was down there. I needed to know if it was just childhood paranoia or something darker. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I crept down to the basement door, my flashlight shaking in my grip. I clicked it on and slowly opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing through the silent house. With each step down the staircase, the air grew heavier, thicker. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering in the flashlight's beam. When I finally reached the bottom, the smell hit me in full force. But now it was mixed with something else: rotting wood, decay, and a strange acrid scent that burned my nostrils. I took a few steps forward, holding my breath. Suddenly, I heard a faint scurrying sound coming from the far corner. It was then that I noticed something unusual. There was an odd gap in the concrete wall, something I hadn't seen before. A chill washed over me as I realized that the crawl space was larger than I remembered, and a narrow passage stretched further back than it had any right to. Swallowing my fear, I inched closer and shone my flashlight into the gap. And that's when I saw them. Old blankets, empty cans, crumpled newspaper clippings, and faded Polaroids strewn across the dirt floor. The photos were strange blurred images of children playing, a family at a dinner table, and then, chillingly, a picture of our house taken from the outside. The angle of the photo looked like it was taken from the street. My heart pounded as I realized that someone had been watching us. Maybe for years. Just as I took a step back, something shifted in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But the scurrying grew louder, and this time it was accompanied by a low, rasping sound. It was the unmistakable sound of someone or something trying to breathe. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as I turned to run. But as I reached the stairs, the basement door above me creaked, and the figure I had seen years ago appeared at the top, backlit by the dim hallway light. It was taller now, its shadow stretching impossibly long, reaching toward me with spindly fingers. "Leave," it rasped, the voice hollow and inhuman. "This is no place for you." The basement light flickered, and the next second, the figure vanished. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, as if it might burst open at any moment. The next morning, my father asked me about the noise. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain what I'd found, but as I looked at him, something stopped me. His eyes were dark, hollow, and a strange sense of dread washed over me. It was as if he already knew. The basement had taken its toll on all of us in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. We moved out a few months later. I convinced my father to let the house go, making up some story about fresh air and a new start. As we drove away, I looked back one last time, and in the basement window, I saw the faint outline of a shadow, watching us leave, waiting patiently for the next family to come. To this day, I still hear it sometimes, that raspy breathing in the dead of night, as if it followed us, lingering in the corners of my mind. I can only hope that, wherever it is, it's still waiting down there in the dark, biding its time. After we moved, life should have gone back to normal, but it didn't. Even though we were miles away from that house, the memories and the terror clung to me, lingering like a dark stain. The first few weeks in our new home were peaceful, but I still felt uneasy, like I was waiting for something to happen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the basement, that hidden gap in the wall, the chilling photographs, and those empty eyes watching us as we left. I tried to ignore it, to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began again. The first sign was a single flea bite on my ankle. I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe there were fleas in the new house too. But the next night, I found another one on my wrist, and then another on my neck. Each morning, I woke up with more, scattered like tiny red pinpricks along my skin. At first, I thought it might be the cat. My parents had adopted a new one, a small, timid tabby named Willow. But the more I watched her, the more uneasy I became. Willow would sit in the hallway at night, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on something I couldn't see. She would hiss at empty air and dart away as if something had lunged at her from the shadows. Then came the breathing. It was faint at first, a barely there whisper of sound in the dead of night. But each time I heard it, it grew louder, raspy and wheezing, like someone gasping for air. No matter how loud it got, though, no one else seemed to hear it. It was as if it were meant only for me. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a pressure on my chest, like invisible hands pressing down, keeping me still. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My room felt colder, the air thick with an old, familiar scent, that stale, metallic odor that haunted my nightmares. And there it was again. That voice, "You left us," it rasped. "But you didn't leave alone." With that, the pressure lifted, and I shot upright in bed, gasping for air. My heart thundered in my chest, but the room was silent, empty. I reached out to turn on my bedside lamp, my hand trembling as the light flooded the room. Everything looked normal, but a chill lingered in the air, and I could still feel the phantom weight pressing down on me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to tell my parents. I told them about the breathing, the bites, and the dreams that haunted me night after night. But they looked at me with blank, distant expressions, as if they couldn't understand, or maybe didn't want to. My father just patted my shoulder and said, "It's in the past, kid. You have to let it go," but I couldn't. That night, I decided to do some research. I thought that maybe, if I could find out more about that old house, I could get some answers. I spent hours online, digging through old records, property listings, and news archives. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The house had been built over 100 years ago and had a long, grim history. Nearly every family that had lived there had reported strange incidents, unexplained illnesses, mysterious disappearances, even sudden, tragic deaths. The basement, I learned, had originally been used as a cold storage room by the original owners, who had immigrated from Europe. They were rumored to have dabbled in the occult, performing dark rituals in the basement to summon spirits or entities they believed would grant them power. But the strangest part was a single newspaper article from 1934. It was a small, almost forgotten piece tucked away in the archives, with a single eerie line. Local family claims to have released the shadow man from their home after an unexplained tragedy. No details were given about the tragedy, but a feeling of dread settled in my stomach. Whatever was in that house, whatever we had seen, it was not gone, it had simply been passed on to us. I spent the following nights researching ways to protect myself, to ward off spirits or malevolent entities. I placed salt in every corner of my room, hung up protective charms, and even burned sage, hoping to drive out whatever had followed us. For a while, it seemed to work. The breathing stopped, and Willow, though still skittish, stopped hissing at empty corners. But as the days grew colder, the nights longer, I could feel it again, watching, waiting, biding its time. Then one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a voice whisper in my ear, "You can't hide forever." I froze, every muscle tensed as I lay in the darkness, too terrified to move. The voice was closer than ever, and I could feel someone leaning over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but the voice only grew louder, hissing and rasping like dry leaves scraping across the floor. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. My parents tried to convince me to stay, but I knew that if I did, it would only get worse. Whatever was in that basement had latched onto me, and it wouldn't rest until it had me. I moved to a different city, miles away from my family, my childhood, and that cursed house. For a while, I thought I was safe. The breathing stopped, the dreams faded, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy. But every October, when the nights grow long and the air turns cold, I feel it again, that faint, familiar rasp of breathing, echoing in the dark corners of my room, and every time I know it's waiting.